The cabin went quiet after the little black boy spoke up. ACT-1, 30,000 feet in the air. Seat 14C. And a 7-year-old boy is about to say something that no one on that plane will ever forget. But before we get to that moment, before the cabin goes silent, before grown adults freeze in their seats, before a flight attendant stops mid-sentence and stares, you need to understand what was already happening on that flight. Because what that little boy said didn't come out of nowhere. It came from everything he had been watching, everything he had been quietly absorbing, everything the adults around him were too distracted, too stressed, or too proud to notice. His name was Marcus, 7 years old, small for his age, the kind of kid who doesn't say much, but when he does speak, you'd better listen. He had his mother's eyes, calm, deep, always reading the room. And on this particular afternoon, on a packed flight from Atlanta to Chicago, those eyes were working overtime. His mother, Diane, sat beside him in the middle seat. She was 34, a nurse, a single mother, a woman who had learned long ago that she had to hold herself together in public spaces no matter what was happening around her. She kept her voice low, her hands folded, her expression neutral, because she already knew how quickly things could go sideways when a black woman traveling alone with her child drew the wrong kind of attention. And on this flight, that attention had already found them. It started with boarding. It always starts with boarding. A flight attendant, professional smile, sharp uniform, the kind of practiced politeness that can flip cold in seconds, had asked Diane twice to verify her seat assignment. Twice. Even though the ticket was right there on her phone. Even though the seat was clearly 14B and 14C, and both she and Marcus were standing right in front of it. Two other passengers in that same row had simply walked in and sat down without being asked a single question. Diane said nothing. She showed the ticket. She sat down. She helped Marcus buckle his seatbelt and told him to put on his headphones. And she exhaled slowly, quietly, in that way that people exhale when they're absorbing something painful and refusing to let it become a scene. Marcus watched all of this. He watched the flight attendant walk away. He watched the man in 14A, a broad-shouldered businessman in a navy blazer, glance over at them, and then look back at his laptop without a word. He watched the row in front of them, where a young white mother was settling her baby into a carrier with the help of the same flight attendant, who was now warm and chatty and completely transformed. Marcus said nothing. He put on his headphones. He looked out the window as the plane began to push back from the gate. But he didn't press play. He was listening. The plane taxied, lifted, climbed through clouds. And somewhere over Tennessee, when the seatbelt sign clicked off and the cabin settled into that low, pressurized hum of a cruising aircraft, Marcus slowly pulled one side of his headphones off his ear. And that's when it happened. Not the emergency. Not yet. Something quieter than that. Something that most people would have missed entirely. Marcus turned to his mother and said, in a voice so calm it almost didn't register at first, "Mom, something smells different near the back." Diane looked at him. She thought he meant the food cart. She thought he meant the lavatory. She said, "It's just a plane, baby. Put your headphones back on." But Marcus didn't put his headphones back on. He turned around slowly in his seat. He looked toward the back of the cabin. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the air vent above his head. And then he looked at his mother one more time with those steady, unblinking eyes. "No, Mom," he said. "It smells like something's burning." The man in 14A heard that. He pulled one earbud out. The woman in 15B, who had been scrolling her phone, looked up. 2 rows back, a teenager stopped typing. And the flight attendant, the same one who had checked Diane's ticket twice, happened to be walking past in that exact moment. She heard the word burning. She stopped, and the cabin, just for a breath, went quiet. If you're new here and you love stories that give you chills in the best possible way, hit that subscribe button right now. We tell stories that the world needs to hear. Don't miss the next one. And tell me right now in the comments, when you first heard Marcus say the word burning, what did you think he meant? Drop it below. I want to know. Airplane Act 2. Now, to understand why that single word from a 7-year-old boy could stop a cabin full of adults in their tracks, you need to understand what kind of flight this already was before Marcus said anything at all. Because this wasn't just a bumpy ride. This was a flight that had been simmering with tension from the moment the boarding doors opened. And Diane had felt every degree of that heat. She had almost not taken this flight. 3 weeks earlier, she had booked it for a reason that broke her heart a little every time she thought about it. Her mother, Marcus's grandmother, the woman who called him her little professor because he asked questions that even she couldn't always answer, had been admitted to a hospital in Chicago with a cardiac event. Not a heart attack, not technically, but close enough that the doctors had used the word monitoring in a way that didn't feel routine. Close enough that Diane had called in 2 shifts at the hospital where she worked, packed a bag in 40 minutes, and booked the next available flight. She had packed Marcus because there was no one to leave him with. His father had not been in the picture for 2 years. Her closest friend worked nights, and Marcus, quiet, observant, impossibly mature for his age, had packed his own backpack without being asked, put his library book on top, and said, "Is Grandma going to be okay?" Diane had told him yes. She believed it when she said it, but she was tired. The kind of tired that settles in the bones when you're doing everything alone and you cannot afford to fall apart. She had been running on coffee and adrenaline since the phone call came, and by the time they got to the airport, she was operating on the thinnest edge of her composure. The airport had not been kind. The security line had been long. A TSA officer had pulled Marcus aside for an additional screening, a phrase that landed on Diane like a weight she had carried her whole life. And Marcus had stood still and patient while a stranger waved a wand around him, and Diane had stood there watching, holding her shoes in one hand, fighting every instinct in her body that told her to say something sharp and true. She didn't. She never did, because she knew what it cost when she did. By the time they boarded, she was already depleted, already running on the discipline of someone who has learned that public spaces require a kind of performance, calm, unthreatening, invisible, that exhausts the soul even when nothing goes wrong. And then the flight attendant had asked her for her ticket. Twice. So when the plane finally lifted off the runway and Marcus put on his headphones and Diane leaned her head back and closed her eyes, she was not resting. She was recovering. The way you recover in the 30 seconds between crises when you're the only adult standing between your child and everything that could go wrong. The businessman in 14A, his name, though neither Diane nor Marcus would ever learn it, was Gerald, had boarded this flight for the 4th time in 3 weeks. Chicago to Atlanta, Atlanta to Chicago. He was a senior partner at a logistics consulting firm, and he had the slightly glazed, slightly irritable energy of someone who had spent too many hours in airport lounges trying to believe that first-class upgrades were worth the emotional cost of his career. He had not looked at Diane with hostility when she sat down. He had simply not looked at her at all, which in its own way was its own kind of statement. He had opened his laptop, started scrolling through a spreadsheet, put in his earbuds, begun the practiced ritual of pretending the seat next to him didn't exist. 2 rows behind Diane and Marcus sat a young woman named Sophie, 26, traveling with a 4-month-old baby she had named Leo. First flight with a baby. She was terrified in that bright, desperate way of new mothers who have read every article and still feel completely unprepared. Leo had been fussing since the gate. Sophie had been cycling through every technique she knew, feeding, rocking, pacifier, singing under her breath, and the flight attendant had been genuinely helpful to her, stopping 3 times to check in, bringing an extra blanket, speaking in the soothing register of someone who understood. Marcus had noticed this too, not with bitterness. Marcus was 7. He didn't have a word for what he noticed. He just filed away the way he filed everything away, quietly, completely, without judgment. He was the kind of child who watched the world the way other children watch cartoons, with total absorption and a mind that was always connecting dots. And now, 40 minutes into the flight, somewhere over Tennessee, the hum of the engines had settled into that deep, rhythmic drone that usually means smooth sailing. The seatbelt sign was off. The drink cart had started making its way down the aisle. Gerald had closed his laptop and was reading something on his phone. Sophie had finally gotten Leo to sleep and was exhaling in the silent, cautious way of someone who knows peace is temporary. Diane had her eyes closed, and Marcus had his headphones on, but not playing anything. He was listening to the plane. He did this on every flight they took, which wasn't many, but he remembered each one. He liked the sounds. The way the engine pitch changed slightly during descent. The click and groan of the landing gear. The particular hiss of the air vents. He found it soothing in the way that mechanical systems soothed him. Predictable, logical, following rules he could almost understand. But something in the last few minutes had shifted. A smell. Not strong. Not alarming, exactly. More like the memory of a smell. The way the air near a toaster smells just before something burns. Sharp. Dry. Slightly acrid under the recycled cabin air. He had noticed it maybe 5 minutes before he said anything. He'd waited. He'd thought maybe he was wrong. He'd looked at the other passengers to see if anyone else was reacting. No one was. Gerald was scrolling. Sophie's baby was asleep. The flight attendant was pouring a ginger ale in the row ahead. And then the smell had gotten slightly stronger. Just slightly. Just enough. And Marcus had pulled off one side of his headphones and said the words that stopped the cart and pulled the earbuds out of Gerald's ears and made a flight attendant freeze mid-step in the aisle. "Mom, something smells like it's burning." Now, the flight attendant, her name was Carol, and she had been working flights for 11 years, had not become a professional air travel safety expert by ignoring the word burning at 30,000 feet. Whatever her personal biases were, whatever she had communicated through her behavior with Diane, her professional training was immediate and absolute. She stopped. She looked at the row. She looked at Marcus. "Sweetheart," she said, and her voice had changed registers entirely. "What did you say?" Marcus looked at her steadily. "It smells like something burning," he repeated. "Near the back. Like an electrical smell. Kind of dry." Carol went very still. Electrical. That specific word. From a 7-year-old. Gerald had fully removed both earbuds now. He was looking at Marcus with an expression he would have difficulty describing later. Sophie, in 16A, had looked up from her sleeping baby. Carol said, "I'll be right back." And the way she said it, quickly, quietly, without the flight attendant smile, told everyone within earshot that something had just changed. The cabin hadn't panicked. Not yet, but it had shifted. Like the atmosphere before a storm, when the air pressure drops just enough that your body registers it before your mind does. The drink cart sat abandoned in the aisle, and Marcus sat in his seat with his headphones around his neck, watching the back of the plane with calm, steady eyes. Hit subscribe if you're already feeling it, because this story is just getting started and you do not want to walk away right now. Comment below. Do you think Marcus was right about what he smelled? Or do you think it was just his imagination working overtime? Tell me what you think before we go further. Warning Act 3. Carol moved down the aisle with the quiet efficiency of someone trying very hard not to cause a scene. Every flight attendant knows this walk. It is the walk that says, "I am completely calm," while every trained instinct in your body is running calculations. She had heard the word electrical from a child, and that word had landed in a specific compartment of her professional memory, the one labeled "Do Not Ignore." She reached the galley at the back of the plane. Her colleague, a younger flight attendant named Derek, who was on only his 2nd year working long-haul domestic routes, was res-tacking the beverage cart. She pulled him aside. She kept her voice at the particular pitch that means important but not urgent yet. She said, "A passenger in 14 mentioned an electrical smell. Have you noticed anything?" Derek stopped what he was doing. He looked at her. He sniffed the air, deliberately, professionally. And then his expression did something that Carol had hoped it wouldn't do. It changed, just slightly, the way a face changes when it recognizes something it didn't want to recognize. "I thought it was just the oven," he said. "We had that heating issue last week on this flight," Carol said. "Not last week. Right now. Is there anything running back here that could produce that smell?" Derek looked at the galley panel. He looked at the overhead compartment where the auxiliary wiring ran. And then he looked at Carol and said the 4 words you never want to hear from a crew member at cruising altitude. "Let me check something." Carol walked back toward the front of the plane, slowly enough not to alarm anyone, quickly enough to close the distance in under 20 seconds. She passed row after row of passengers who were doing exactly what passengers do, scrolling, sleeping, watching movies on the seatback screens, completely unaware that two trained aviation professionals had just begun a process that is drilled into them repeatedly during certification. She passed row 14. She glanced at Marcus. He was still sitting with his headphones around his neck, his library book open on his lap, but his eyes were tracking her. Not anxiously, just watching, the way he watched everything. She gave him a small nod. The kind adults give children when they want to say, "I heard you," without saying it out loud. Diane, who had her eyes open now and had been watching Carol's movements with the quiet alertness of someone trained to read environments, looked at her son. Marcus looked back at his mother, and Diane felt something move through her chest. Not quite fear, not yet, but the unmistakable sensation of the world shifting its weight. "Baby," she said softly, "what exactly does it smell like?" Marcus thought about this. He was the kind of child who thought before he spoke, who chose his words with the deliberateness of someone who understood that words had weight. "You know when you plug too many things into an extension cord at Grandma's house," he said, "and it starts to get warm and you can smell it? Like that, but drier. And it keeps coming through the vent when the air blows." Diane looked at the air vent above their heads. She reached up slowly and held her hand near it. And there, in the recycled, pressurized cabin air, under the smell of someone's fast food and the faint antiseptic haze that lives in all airplanes, she caught it. Faint, dry, just this side of nothing, but real. She sat forward. She pressed the call button. 2 rows back, Gerald had heard enough of this exchange to pull his own attention away from his phone. He was a man who dealt in systems, logistics, supply chains, contingency plans, and he had a particular sensitivity to the word vent. His firm had once spent 3 months auditing an airline's ground maintenance operations, and he had seen the reports. He knew what an electrical fault at altitude could mean. He pushed that knowledge back down firmly, because he was also a man who didn't panic. But he watched. He watched the button above Diane's seat illuminate. He watched the aisle for Carol's return. In row 16, Sophie had woken Leo up, trying to crane forward to see what was happening. And now Leo was fussing again, and Sophie was split between the maternal emergency of a crying baby and the unmistakable human instinct that says something in this environment requires your attention. The turbulence that began at that moment was mild. The plane shuddered, not violently, just that rhythmic, rolling movement that pilots call light chop. The seatbelt sign chimed on. A few passengers grabbed their armrests automatically. Someone behind Diane muttered something. A child 3 rows up laughed, because children sometimes laugh during turbulence before they understand what it is. Marcus did not laugh. He did not grab his armrest. He reached up and put his hand flat against the overhead panel above his window seat, just for a second, and then he looked at his hand. And then he looked at his mother. "Mom," he said, "it's a little warm." Diane stared at him. The panel, just a little. "You can feel it." She reached up, and there was, barely noticeable, the kind of warmth you would dismiss 100 times out of 100 if you weren't already looking for it. A subtle, faint heat radiating from the panel above the window. The kind of warmth that should not exist in an airplane interior. Carol arrived. She saw Diane's hand on the overhead panel, and her face, which she had been keeping professionally composed for the last 4 minutes, did something it wasn't supposed to do. It went serious in a way that the surrounding rows could see. "Ma'am," she said, "I need you to keep your seatbelts fastened. Both of you." She looked at Marcus. Her tone was completely different from the tone she had used when she asked for Diane's ticket. The professional cool had collapsed into something genuine. "Can you show me where you felt the warmth?" Marcus pointed, calmly, precisely. No drama. Just a 7-year-old boy pointing at a panel the way he would point at a picture in a book. Carol pressed her own hand to the spot. She held it there for 2 seconds, 3, and then she straightened up, and she said, almost to herself, in a voice that was not quite calm enough, "Okay." She moved to the interphone on the wall, lifted the receiver, and turned slightly away from the cabin. The conversation she had with the cockpit lasted 45 seconds. The passengers nearest the aisle could not hear the words, but they could hear the tone, and the tone was not routine. Gerald was now fully upright in his seat. He had put his phone in his pocket. He was looking at the back of Carol's head with the focused, calculating attention of someone running scenarios. Sophie's baby had gone quiet again, perhaps sensing something in the air that even infants can register, some shift in the electrical charge of collective human attention. In the cabin, which had been humming with the comfortable white noise of cruising flight, had begun to accumulate a silence. Not loud silence, not the silence of panic, just the silence of 47 people beginning, at slightly different moments, to realize that something in their environment had changed. Marcus sat in his seat. He had opened his library book again, but his eyes were not moving across the page. He was listening. Subscribe right now if you're on the edge of your seat, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about this flight. Tell me in the comments, at this point in the story, are you trusting Marcus completely, or do you still think there might be another explanation? What's going through your mind right now? ACT-4. The cockpit conversation lasted 45 seconds on Carol's end. On the other end, it lasted considerably longer. Captain Renata Okafor had been flying commercial aircraft for 19 years. She had 3,000 hours on this exact model of aircraft. She had flown through storms that turned the sky green, had executed emergency landings in conditions that would make most people's hands shake just to hear about, and had developed over 2 decades in the air a particular quality that the best pilots share: the ability to receive bad news with a completely calm face while internally running every protocol simultaneously. When Carol said the words "passenger reported electrical smell," confirmed warmth in overhead panel, crew checking aft galley, Captain Okafor did not visibly react. Her first officer, James, 31, for years on the job, glanced at her. She held up a single finger in his direction, which meant wait. She asked Carol 3 questions: where exactly, since when, any visible smoke or discoloration. She got the answers. She said, "Keep me updated every 2 minutes. Don't alarm the cabin." She hung up. Then she looked at James and said, "We may have a wiring issue in the aft section. Start the checklist." James reached for the binder. In the back galley, Derek had found something. It was subtle, the kind of thing a first-year crew member might have missed, and in fact had been missing for the last 20 minutes. A small section of the housing that covered the auxiliary wiring conduit behind the galley cabinet had a faint discoloration at one edge. Not black, not burned, just a brownish, heat-stressed fading of the material that told anyone with the right knowledge exactly what it meant. He pressed the back of his hand against it, the way you test a stove burner, carefully, ready to pull away. It was warm, more than warm. He photographed it with his phone, protocol, and called Carol on the interphone. What was happening, as the engineers and investigators would later explain in the report, was not catastrophic. Not immediately, but it was not nothing. A section of wiring in the aft auxiliary system had developed a fault, a frayed insulation point where 2 wires were making intermittent contact. Every time they touched, they generated heat. The heat was dissipating slowly through the aircraft's ventilation system, which was why the smell had been so faint, so distributed, why it had smelled like a warm extension cord rather than an obvious fire. Left unchecked, the fault would escalate. The wiring would continue to heat. The material surrounding it would begin to char. And eventually, at a timeline the engineers couldn't pin to the minute, but estimated in terms of hours, the heat would reach a threshold. No one on that plane knew any of this yet. But Marcus had smelled the beginning of the process. And his description, dry, electrical, coming through the vent, had been precise enough that Carol had used the right words with the captain, and the captain had started the right checklist, and Derek had found the right panel. All because a 7-year-old in seat 14C had been listening when everyone else had their headphones on. But that knowledge was still moving through its channels. It had not yet reached the cabin. What the cabin was experiencing instead was the particular unease of a flight that has begun to feel different without being told why. It's one of the strangest collective human experiences. A group of strangers, sealed in a metal tube, each privately updating their threat assessment based on fragments of information they can barely see. A flight attendant who stops moving through the aisle. A call button lit in row 14. A phone pressed to an ear at the back of the plane. A seatbelt sign that stays on longer than expected. None of these things are alarming alone. Together, assembled in the imagination of 100 anxious brains, They become something that buzzes with unnamed dread. The turbulence came back. Heavier this time. The plane rolled left, steadied, rolled again. A drink cup slid off a tray table in row 22 and hit the floor with a sound that made 6 people flinch simultaneously. A woman 2 rows behind Gerald made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a word. Leo, startled awake for the second time, began to cry with the full lung capacity of a 4-month-old who has had enough of all of this. And then the lights flickered. Not completely. Not a power outage. Just a single, brief dimming. A half-second where the cabin lights dropped and came back. The kind of thing that would normally produce a few nervous laughs and an immediate return to normalcy. The kind of thing that happens on turbulent flights and means nothing. Except that today, on this flight, in this cabin where 2 flight attendants have been making carefully hushed phone calls and a 7-year-old had already announced the word burning, it meant everything. The nervous laugh didn't come. Instead, the cabin filled with the sound of 47 people making 47 different quiet, involuntary sounds of fear. Seatbacks snapped forward. Laptops closed. Movies paused. Headphones came off. People who had been sealed in their own private bubbles for the last 40 minutes suddenly became intensely, collectively aware of each other and of everything around them. Gerald sat perfectly straight in 14A. He had spent 30 seconds calculating scenarios and had arrived at the calm, awful clarity of a man who understands that in an emergency, the most valuable thing you can contribute is not panic. He looked at Marcus. Marcus was looking back at him. "You got a good nose, kid," Gerald said. It was the first thing he had said to either of them since boarding. Marcus looked at him for a moment. "I know," he said, not arrogantly, just as a fact. Diane was pressing her call button again. It was already lit. She pressed it anyway, the way you press it when you need to do something with your hands. Sophie had Leo against her chest and was doing the rhythmic, slightly frantic bouncing that parents in crisis deploy automatically. Her face was the face of someone trying to hold 2 states in their body at once. I am calm for my baby, and I'm extremely scared, and failing to fully commit to either. The flight attendant call chime sounded from multiple seats now. Not just 14B, a cascade of chimes, like a string of bells going off down the aisle, as passengers who had been waiting for a signal that something was wrong decided that the flickering lights had been that signal. Carol came out from the back. She walked the aisle with the particular gait of someone moving at maximum speed while appearing to move at normal speed. She reached row 14. She bent toward Diane and spoke in a low voice. "Ma'am, I need to ask you and your son to stay calm. We're following standard procedures. Everything is it the wiring?" Diane said, quietly, directly, with the specific authority of a nurse who has heard enough medical half-truths to know when someone is managing her rather than informing her. Carol paused, a fraction of a second too long. "We're investigating," she said. "My son smelled it 20 minutes ago," Diane said. "He told you. What did you find in the back?" Another pause. Gerald was listening to every word. Sophie, in 16A, had tilted toward the aisle. Carol made a decision. The kind of decision that flight attendants are not technically supposed to make, but that 11 years of reading passengers had taught her to trust sometimes. She leaned in a little closer. "The captain is aware," she said. "We're taking it seriously. Your son's information helped us find it faster." Diane closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. When she opened them, they were steady. "Okay," she said. "What do we need to do?" "Stay in your seats. Seat belts fastened. Don't alarm the people around you." "Already done," Diane said. Carol straightened up. She looked at Marcus one more time, and then she said something that she had not said to him since the beginning of the flight. Something that was late and insufficient and real all at once. "Thank you," she said. "You did good." Marcus looked at her with those steady, deep eyes. "Is it going to be okay?" he asked. Carol held his gaze. "We're going to make sure it is," she said. She moved down the aisle. The turbulence rolled through again. The plane groaned in that way that planes groan. Not a warning sound, just the sound of metal adjusting to forces, a sound completely normal that feels completely terrifying when you're already afraid. Someone in the back rows said, "Oh, God," loud enough to be heard. A child two rows behind Marcus started to cry. Not Leo, a different child, older, who had understood enough of what was happening to be scared. In the cockpit, Captain Okafor had already contacted Chicago O'Hare. She had declared a precautionary emergency. Not a full mayday, not yet, but the designation that means clear our runway. Have equipment ready. We are coming in carefully and quickly. The estimated distance to O'Hare was 112 miles. At current speed, 22 minutes. 22 minutes. Marcus opened his library book again. He found his place. He read 3 sentences. Then he looked up at the air vent, then at his mother, then back at his book. His knee was touching Diane's knee. She didn't move away. She leaned into it very slightly, so he would know without having to say anything that she was there. In row 14A, Gerald had put his hands flat on his thighs and was breathing with the deliberateness of someone who runs rather than reacts. He was looking at the seat back in front of him. He was thinking about his daughter in Chicago. He was thinking about the logistics report he'd never finished. He was thinking about a 7-year-old who smelled something that trained adults had missed. The cabin was not in chaos. Not yet, but it was in that specific, charged condition that sits right on the edge of it, the moment before a crowd becomes a crowd, before individual fear becomes collective fear, before the social contract that keeps strangers polite in enclosed spaces starts to develop visible cracks. The seatbelt sign remained on. The lights held steady. The engines maintained their pitch. And Marcus sat in seat 14C with his library book open and watched the back of the plane with eyes that missed nothing. Don't you dare leave now. Subscribe so you never miss a story that grabs you like this one. This is only getting more intense. Here's what I need to know from you right now. When Carol said, "Your son's information helped us find it faster," what did you feel in that moment? Pride? Relief? Something else? Drop it in the comments below. ACT 5. 22 minutes sounds like nothing. Ask anyone waiting for good news, and they'll tell you 22 minutes passes in a breath. Ask anyone sealed in a pressurized aluminum fuselage at 30,000 feet with a wiring fault in the aft section and a cabin full of frightened strangers and a seatbelt sign that won't go off, and they will tell you that 22 minutes is an ocean. The first 5 minutes after Carol's walk down the aisle were the hardest. The information vacuum was doing what information vacuums always do, filling with speculation, with overheard fragments, with the terrifying creativity of the human mind when it is frightened and underinformed. People were leaning across their seat partners, speaking in urgent half-whispers. Someone had Googled something on their phone and was now reading it with an expression that was not helping anyone. The man in 22C had flagged down Derek and was asking questions in a tone that was several degrees past assertive, and Derek was using every ounce of his training to stay composed and informative without saying anything that would accelerate the panic. Gerald turned to Diane. He had made a decision that sat a little uncomfortably with him. The recognition that this woman beside him, whom he had functionally ignored for the first hour of this flight, had the only information that mattered right now. "Do you know what they found?" he asked. Direct. No preamble. Diane looked at him. She thought about what Carol had told her. She thought about the warmth in the panel. She thought about 19 years of nursing, which had taught her that people under stress need accurate information more than they need comfort. "Some kind of wiring issue in the back," she said. "The captain knows. They've probably already contacted the airport." Gerald absorbed this. "Electrical fault," he said, not as a question. "Which explains the smell your son noticed." "Yes." "How long ago did he first notice it?" "Before he said anything?" "He told me he noticed it a few minutes before he said something. He waited to see if anyone else reacted first." Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Marcus. "Why did you wait?" he asked, genuinely curious. Marcus looked up from his book. He thought about this with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything. "Because I wasn't sure," he said, "and I didn't want to scare anyone if I was wrong." Gerald stared at him for a long moment. He thought about the junior analysts at his firm who spoke before they were certain, who inflated their confidence to compensate for their doubt. He thought about how many decisions had been made badly in rooms he'd sat in because no one had the discipline to wait until they were sure. "That's exactly right," Gerald said quietly. "That is exactly right. Sophie, who had been listening from 16A while bouncing a now calm Leo, leaned forward. "What's happening?" she asked. "Can someone please tell me what's happening? I have a baby, and I need to know if I should be scared." Diane turned around. She looked at Sophie. She used the voice she used with patience, not soothing in a way that patronized, but steady in a way that transmitted actual information. "There's a wiring issue the crew is monitoring," she said. "The captain is aware. We're likely being brought in to land sooner than planned. You should keep your baby close and your seatbelt fastened, and beyond that, you're doing everything right." Sophie's face did something complicated. "Are you a doctor?" she asked. "Nurse," Diane said. "For 14 years. We're going to be fine." Sophie exhaled. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Thank you." This was the moment the dynamics of row 14 and the rows immediately surrounding it permanently shifted. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, simply because a black woman in the middle seat of row 14 had, in 2 brief exchanges, become the most credible and calming source of information within a 20-foot radius. And the people around her, people who had not given her a second glance during boarding, people who had watched the flight attendant check her ticket without saying a word, were now anchoring to her the way frightened people anchor to whoever is steady. Gerald had his phone out. He was looking at a map, calculating the distance to O'Hare. "If they're doing a precautionary," he murmured, "we're probably 20 minutes out. Maybe less." "About that," Diane said. "Have you been in an emergency landing before?" "No. But I've read enough incident reports to know that precautionary landings go fine 99% of the time when the crew catches it early." She glanced at Marcus when she said catches it early. Marcus was looking at the back of the plane again, and then something happened that brought the whole cabin to silence. Marcus stood up, not dramatically, not suddenly. He simply unbuckled his seatbelt, which technically he wasn't supposed to do with the sign on, and he stood in the aisle beside his seat, and he faced the back of the plane. And he said, in a voice that was not loud, but was extremely clear, the way voices carry in a quiet room, "Mom, the smell is stronger." He didn't say it to alarm anyone. He said it the same way he said everything, as a report. Factual, precise. He was telling his mother because his mother needed to know. But 37 other people heard it, and the cabin went quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of an airplane. The extraordinary quiet of 47 people holding their breath simultaneously. Movies paused. Conversation stopped. Even Leo went quiet, the way infants sometimes go quiet when the air pressure of a room changes. You could hear the engines. You could hear the ventilation system. You could hear someone in the back swallow. Every eye in the cabin that was not already looking forward was looking now at a 7-year-old boy standing in the aisle of row 14, small and still and completely unafraid. Carol appeared from the front galley. She had been monitoring the aisle. She saw Marcus standing. She walked toward him quickly and opened her mouth to ask him to sit down. And then she stopped, because she could smell it too. Here, in the middle of the cabin, where before it had only been detectable near the rear, she could now smell it. Faint, dry, electrical, unmistakable. She pulled out the interphone from the nearest station. She turned slightly away, but not far enough. Her voice was low, but the cabin was so silent that it carried. "Captain, the smell has moved forward. Passenger confirmed. Request immediate descent." The response from the cockpit, through the interphone, was 4 words. "Already on it. Brace." And then Captain Okafor's voice came over the cabin PA, calm, professional, carrying the specific authority of someone who is trained for exactly this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are beginning our descent into Chicago O'Hare. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened. Our crew will be taking their seats. We expect to be on the ground in approximately 15 minutes. Not 15 minutes. Less." Gerald's jaw was tight. Sophie was holding Leo against her with both arms. The woman in 22C was pressing her palms flat on the tray table in front of her. Diane reached up and took Marcus's hand. She guided him gently back into his seat. She buckled his seatbelt. She buckled her own. And then she took her son's face in both hands, just for a second, and she looked at him and said, quietly, so only he could hear, You were right. You were right the whole time." Marcus looked at his mother. And for the first time since the flight began, something shifted in his face. The composed, watchful steadiness dropped just slightly, and underneath it was what he always was, what he would always be, what no amount of calm or maturity could fully cover. A 7-year-old boy who was a little scared, who needed his mom to tell him it was going to be okay. "I know," he said. His voice was a little smaller than usual. "We're going to be okay," she said. "I know," he said again, and he leaned his head against her arm. The cabin had not descended into panic. Something else had happened instead, something rarer and harder to manufacture. In the presence of the boy who had warned them, in the presence of the mother who had believed him, in the presence of that enormous quiet that had fallen over the plane when Marcus stood up and said the smell was stronger, something like collective clarity had arrived. Not calm exactly, not the absence of fear, but something that shared space with fear. A mutual recognition, a shared understanding that they were all in this together, and that the smallest person on the plane had been paying the most attention. Gerald unbuckled his seatbelt, also against protocol, for exactly long enough to turn sideways and say to the row behind him, "Everyone stay seated and keep your seatbelts on. We're 20 minutes from the ground, and we're going to be fine." His voice was firm and grounded, and it carried down 5 rows. People who heard it straightened up. People who were on the edge of something pulled back. Then he rebuckled his seatbelt. The plane tilted forward into its descent. The pressure in the cabin shifted. The engines changed pitch. Out the windows, through the thin cloud cover, the flat geometry of Illinois was becoming visible. Roads and fields, and the silver thread of a highway. Marcus looked out the window. He watched the ground coming up. He watched it with those steady, quiet eyes. "Mom," he said. "Yeah, baby. Can we call Grandma when we land?" Diane made a sound that was half laugh and half the release of everything she had been holding for the last hour. She pressed her lips together. She nodded. "First thing," she said. The ground rose up to meet them. "Subscribe. Right now. Because the landing is only the beginning of what happens next. And the most emotional moment of this entire story is still coming." Tell me in the comments, when Marcus said the smell is stronger and the whole cabin went quiet, what were you feeling? That moment. Describe it. I want to read every single one of your answers. ACT6. The landing was smooth. Not dramatically smooth. Not the kind of landing that earns applause, because it was unexpectedly soft. Just smooth in the way that safe landings are smooth, where the wheels meet the runway with a bump and a rush, and the engines roar in reverse thrust, and you feel the whole machine slowing, and then you're on the ground, and you are alive, and the relief of that, the pure animal relief of solid earth beneath you, moves through 47 bodies simultaneously like a wave. Several people exhaled at a volume they probably weren't aware of. A woman in row 19 pressed both hands over her mouth. The man in 22C, who had been asking insistent questions of Derek for the last 15 minutes, put his face in his hands, not crying, just releasing. Sophie was crying. Quietly, the way new mothers cry when the adrenaline finally breaks and comes out not as fear, but as gratitude. Leo, perhaps deciding that if his mother was crying it must be safe to relax, had fallen asleep against her chest with the profound commitment that only infants can manage. Gerald was looking out the window. The runway. The flat, ordinary, miraculous runway. He watched it with an expression that he would not have wanted anyone to see. Too open, too unguarded, stripped of the professional composure that he usually kept on in public like a second suit. Emergency vehicles were visible at the edge of the tarmac. Fire trucks, positioned at a distance. Lights going. Present but not needed. Standing by in the particular way that emergency infrastructure stands by when a crisis has been caught early enough that it is almost a non-event. The precautionary detail. The machinery of prevention deployed in time. Captain Okafor came on the PA as they rolled toward the gate. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago O'Hare. On behalf of myself and the crew, I want to thank you for your patience and your calm during this flight. Our maintenance team will be boarding to address a technical matter. We'd ask that you remain seated until we have reached the gate. Thank you for flying with us. No details, no specifics, The controlled language of aviation professionals who know that what you say in the moment of the crisis and what is said in the debrief are two different conversations. But it didn't matter. The people in rows 12 through 19 knew. They had been there. They had heard a child's voice say the smell is stronger and watched a cabin go silent. They had the information they needed, which was simply this. It was real. The thing Marcus had noticed was real. The flight attendant had confirmed it. The captain had confirmed it. The fire trucks, standing at the edge of the runway, confirmed it. The plane came to a stop. The jetway extended. The door opened. And then something happened that no one had orchestrated, that no one had planned, that had nothing to do with any protocol or procedure in any aviation manual ever written. The man in row 17, middle-aged, quiet, had not said a word the entire flight, started clapping. Not loudly, just a single, deliberate clap, and then another. And it spread, the way these things spread. Not because of social pressure, not because anyone was watching, but because collective experience creates collective response. And what had just happened to 47 strangers in a metal tube was something that none of them would fully process for days, but which they all understood in their bodies right now. The applause was brief. Not the frenzied kind, the exhaled kind, the we made it kind. And in the middle of it, several people in the surrounding rows were looking at row 14. At Marcus. He had his headphones on. He was finally playing something. Diane looked at her son and felt something she would spend a long time trying to find the words for. Pride was the obvious word, and it was accurate, but it was too small. It was something more specific than pride. It was the feeling of knowing with absolute certainty that the person you have been raising, the person you have worried over and sacrificed for and stayed up nights hoping you were doing right by, was everything you hoped they were. And more. Carol came down the aisle. She stopped at row 14. She crouched beside the seat, so she was at eye level with Marcus. He took off his headphones and looked at her. "I owe you an apology," she said. And her voice was not the professional voice or the management voice or even the genuine but formal voice she had used when she thanked him before. It was something quieter than all of those. Not just for tonight. For earlier, when you both boarded. Diane looked at her. She hadn't expected this. "I wasn't fair to you," Carol said, speaking to Diane now. "And I want you to know that I know that." Diane held her gaze. She said nothing for a moment. Then, "Thank you for listening to him when it mattered." Carol nodded. She looked at Marcus one more time. "You're something else, kid," she said. "I know," Marcus said again. And this time, there was the very beginning of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Carol stood up. She moved toward the exit. Gerald had been watching this. He had his carry-on in his hand now. He was standing in the aisle, waiting for the cue to start moving. He looked at Diane and Marcus, and he thought about a lot of things in a very short space of time. The way humans do when a close call has temporarily dissolved the walls between them and the things that actually matter. "I hope your mother is okay," he said to Diane. "In Chicago." Diane looked at him, slightly surprised. She hadn't mentioned her mother to him. But on a flight like this one, information moves. "Thank you," she said. "I hope she is too." Gerald reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, the kind that cost more to print than they should. He held it out. "If there's anything I can do for either of you," he stopped. He seemed to realize the inadequacy of what he was about to say. He shifted. "He deserves to be recognized," he said. "What he did, what he noticed, how he handled it. Someone should know about this." Diane took the card. She looked at it. She looked at Gerald. "A lot of people already know," she said with a quiet precision that landed in the space between them and stayed there. Gerald nodded. He understood exactly what she meant. The queue began to move. People filed off the plane in the ordinary, shuffling way of deplaning passengers, carry-ons coming down from overheads, phones coming on, the 1,000 small reassemblies of regular life that happen the moment a journey ends. But the people from rows 12 through 19 moved differently than they had boarded. Slower, more aware of each other, making eye contact in the aisle in ways that strangers don't normally make eye contact. Sophie stopped beside Diane's row. Leo was awake, looking around with the uncomprehending curiosity of a baby who has no idea what has just happened and finds the lights of the jetway bridge extremely interesting. Sophie looked at Marcus. "I'm going to tell Leo about you someday," she said. When he's older, I'm going to tell him about the little boy on the plane who noticed what everyone else missed. Marcus thought about this. What will you tell him? He asked. Sophie smiled. It was an exhausted, genuine, beautiful smile. That some people pay attention, she said, and it makes all the difference. She moved past. Diane helped Marcus with his backpack. He put his library book inside, the one he had barely read, the one that had served mainly as a prop for the quiet work of watching and listening and waiting until he was certain. As they stepped off the plane and into the jetway, Diane pulled out her phone. She found her mother's number. She typed, "We just landed. We're coming. We're okay." She put the phone in her pocket. She took Marcus's hand. "You did good, baby," she said. Marcus squeezed her hand. "Can we get food?" he asked. "I'm starving." And Diane laughed, really laughed, the kind of laugh that lives on the other side of fear, and they walked up the jetway together and into the terminal. If you made it this far, you already know you need to subscribe, because you and I both know you're going to want to come back for the next one. Tell me, what did you feel when Carol apologized? Was it enough? Was it too late? Was it exactly right? I want your honest answer in the comments. ACT-7. The maintenance crew that boarded Flight 2247 that evening found what they expected to find, in the location they expected to find it, at a severity level that the investigators later described in their report with the phrase early stage fault with escalation potential. Translation: it had been caught in time, not by a wide margin. The thermal damage to the insulation was consistent with a fault that had been active for 30 to 40 minutes by the time the plane landed. Another 2 hours, possibly less, and the calculus of potential would have shifted to something harder to walk back from. The report credited the flight crew's swift response to passenger notification. It did not name the passenger. Reports don't do that. But Carol knew. Derek knew. Captain Okafor, who read the full incident debrief in her hotel room that night, knew. She sat with her coffee going cold beside her, and she thought about a 7-year-old child who had smelled something the crew had missed and had described it with the precision of an electrical engineer, who had waited until he was certain, who had said the words calmly and been dismissed, and said them again and been dismissed again, and had then stood up in the aisle when the smell reached a threshold and reported the escalation exactly as it happened. She thought about this for a long time. She wrote in her personal journal that night, something she did rarely, a single paragraph. She described what had happened in the clinical language she was accustomed to, and then she stopped and crossed it out, and she wrote something different. She wrote, "A child noticed what we should have noticed. He wasn't afraid to say so twice. He wasn't afraid of being wrong or being dismissed. That's not just good observation. That's courage, the kind that takes more nerve in some bodies than in others." She underlined "in some bodies." She stared at it. She left it. Diane's mother was discharged from the hospital 4 days later. A stent had been placed. The cardiac event had been addressed. She came home to her apartment in Wicker Park with new medication and a new dietary plan and the particular stubborn vitality of a 71-year-old woman who has decided she is not done yet. When Marcus came through her door, she held him for a long time. She pressed her face into the top of his head and breathed. And when he pulled back and looked at her and said, "Grandma, I have to tell you what happened on the plane," she sat down at her kitchen table and folded her hands and said, "Baby, I have all the time in the world." She listened to the whole story. She didn't interrupt. She didn't exclaim. She just listened with the total, unhurried attention of a grandmother who understands that this is what her grandchildren will remember. Not the gift she gives, not the food she cooks, but the way she listens. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you know why you noticed when the other people didn't?" Marcus thought about it. "Because I was paying attention?" "Yes," she said. "But why were you paying attention when everyone else had stopped?" He thought about this longer. "Because," he said slowly, "I like to understand how things work. And when something changes, I want to know why." She nodded. She reached across the table and took his hand in both of hers, small, brown, strong, the hands of a woman who had raised children and grandchildren and had lived long enough to know that the world is a place where paying attention is not just a skill, but a form of survival, and sometimes a form of grace. "Don't ever stop that," she said. "Don't ever let them convince you to stop that." Gerald called Diane 3 days later. He had already spoken to his contacts. He would not say who specifically. He was a man who understood discretion, but he had told the story. The right version of the story. Not the version that got lost in the shuffle of a maintenance report. The version where a black woman and her 7-year-old son boarded a flight and were treated as less than they were, and where that 7-year-old boy then demonstrated the kind of awareness and composure and precise communication that most adults would struggle to access on their best day, under pressure. He asked Diane if Marcus would be interested in participating in a youth aviation program that one of his clients ran, a STEM initiative that worked with kids between 8 and 14. He mentioned that the program had a scholarship component. Diane told him she would think about it. She thought about it for exactly 12 hours. Then she said yes. Carol filed her own supplemental report. The part of it that addressed the initial boarding interaction with the passenger in 14B. The double-checking of the ticket, she wrote clearly and without self-exculpation. She had a meeting with her supervisor. The conversation was not easy. She did not expect it to be easy. She had not filed the report because it was easy. She had filed it because what Marcus had said to her on the plane, in his 7-year-old's voice that somehow carried the clarity of a much older person. I wasn't sure, and I didn't want to scare anyone if I was wrong, had stayed with her in a way she couldn't put down. If a child could hold himself to that standard of accountability, could wait until he was certain, could speak up anyway when he could accept dismissal and return with the same calm, then Carol could hold herself to a standard too. The standard of looking at what she had done and calling it what it was. Marcus went back to school the following Monday. He did not tell most of his classmates. He told his best friend Jerome, who told approximately everyone within 30 seconds, which is what best friends do. By lunch, Marcus had been asked to retell the story 4 times. Each time, he told it the same way. Not with drama, not with embellishment, just the facts in order with the details that mattered. The smell like a warm extension cord, the warm panel, saying it twice, standing up when the smell got stronger, the landing, the fire trucks, Carol saying thank you. His teacher, Ms. Patterson, heard the story from Jerome first. She pulled Marcus aside after class. She said, "I heard what happened." "Yeah," he said. "How did you know what you were smelling?" He looked at her. "I didn't know for sure at first," he said. "That's why I waited." Ms. Patterson looked at this child, this particular child who sat in the 3rd row, who read ahead, who asked questions that forced her to think harder than the lesson plan required. And she thought about what the world does with children like this. How it notices some of them and misses others. How it amplifies some voices and mutes others before those voices have even fully developed. How much depends on who is in the room, who is listening, who asks the question that gives the child the space to answer. She thought about a flight attendant who had checked a ticket twice. She thought about a child who had been right anyway. "You did something extraordinary," she said. Marcus considered this. "I just noticed," he said. "Anyone could have noticed." Miss Patterson held his gaze. "But they didn't," she said. And here's what stays with me about this story. Not just the technical detail, the caught fault, the precautionary landing, the maintenance crew and their report. Not just the arc of recognition, the people who doubted and then didn't. Not even the moment of the cabin going quiet, as powerful as that was. What stays with me is what Marcus said to his grandmother at her kitchen table. "I like to understand how things work. And when something changes, I want to know why." There are children everywhere who are paying that kind of attention, who are sitting in environments that are not designed for them, in rooms where they have already been asked to prove themselves in ways that others are not asked, and who are watching and listening and filing it all away with the patient, precise, unbreakable intelligence that cannot be taught or tested or credentialed. It can only be witnessed. This story is about a wiring fault on a commercial aircraft. It is also about what happens when we decide, in advance and without evidence, that some people have less to offer. What costs, what we miss, how close we can come, sometimes to consequences we never have to face, and why that narrow escape belongs, in ways we often fail to acknowledge, to the people we were most ready to overlook. Marcus's grandmother told him not to stop paying attention. I want to tell you the same thing. Pay attention to who is being heard. Pay attention to who is being ignored. Pay attention to what changes when a child stands up in an aisle and says the smell is stronger and every adult in earshot goes quiet. Pay attention to what that silence means, because sometimes the most important voice in a room is the one nobody expected to speak up. And sometimes it takes a 7-year-old boy at 30,000 feet to remind us of that. If this story moved you, and I believe it did, then subscribe right now. Hit that bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because these stories matter. These people matter. And your attention to them matters more than you know. And for my final question, I want you to think about this genuinely before you answer. Was there ever a moment in your life when you noticed something important and weren't sure if you should speak up? What happened? Did you say something or did you stay quiet? Tell me your story in the comments. Because every single one of you has a Marcus moment somewhere inside you. And I want to hear it. This has been the full story of Marcus, Diane, and Flight 2247. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. See you on the next one.